Welcome to Hubbell's Lake and to the reading of the book Endurance. We are now on Chapter 2, Ice. Shackleton's plan was as bold as it was ambitious. 14 men of the Weddell Sea Party aboard the Endurance were to establish a base on the Antarctic continent. 6 would head for the pole and beyond to the Ross Sea, on the Pacific side of the continent, a distance of some 2,000 miles. A support party from the expedition's other ship, Aurora, was to meet them on the Beardmore Glacier. A party of 3 would go east from the Weddell Sea Camp and explore nearby Enderby Land. Still, another 3-man party would proceed west toward Graham Land. All would make geological and meteorological observations as well as gather geographical data. 2 men of the shore party were to remain at the base. Those left aboard the Endurance were to sail to Graham Land and trace the uncharted coastline there. First, though, the ice had to be conquered. On the morning of the 3rd day after leaving South Georgia, the lookout called out and pointed into the distance. For a long moment, the officers on the bridge squinted across the sea. Shackleton saw it first, then Worsley. The long, low line of pack ice stretching away to a thread on the horizon. The men crowded the railing and said little. For many, it was the first encounter. Yet even the veterans of the Antarctic were quiet. For days, the Endurance skirted the pack as Worsley and Shackleton looked for lanes of open water. The pack in this latitude was loose, and for a while, the Endurance made good time. But as it sailed farther south, the pack became denser. When the ship was surrounded by thick ice floes, Worsley ordered full speed ahead, and the ship rammed the ice with its reinforced knife-like prow to split open the ice. Shackleton watched from the bridge, keeping an eye on the weather and the state of the ice. The air became colder. Snow squalls struck more frequently. On many days, the sky was overcast, and then Worsley could navigate the ship using the ice blink. This trick of nature gave a navigator a more far-reaching picture of the sea and ice ahead of his own eyesight. Light reflected from areas of ice appeared white on the underside of the cloud cover. Open water showed black. Leads between the floes appeared as dark lines that could be followed to areas of open sea. By taking advantage of this natural radar, Worsley worked the ship southward. On clear days, Worsley had to slow down and search for leads or make his own. Navigating became more difficult. Even on such clear days, Worsley spent hours waiting to get a sun fix with his sextant. Although the sun was visible, the horizon was distorted by mirages from the reflection of light through areas of cold air over the ice and warmer air over the open water. At times, Worsley, squinting through the eyepiece, thought he was looking at an entire city. Shackleton spent more and more time on the bridge. He paced back and forth, shoulders hunched, eyes always on the horizon. On the 35th day out of South Georgia, he saw what he was looking for, the Antarctic continent. He called Wild to the bridge. Together they looked across the ice at the line of coast in the distance. Soon the Endurance was skirting that part of the continent called Coates Land. A few days later, uncharged land was sighted and mapped. Shackleton named the newly discovered shore Caird Coast in honor of his biggest backer, James Key Caird. For a brief time, they stopped in a small blight which Shackleton named Glacier Bay. Then the Endurance moved west and south, deeper into the Weddell Sea towards the proposed landing near Vachel Bay. As the ship worked along the coast, Worsley held it as close to the continent's edge as possible, for it offered shelter and some open water. But from time to time, They had to move out into the pack ice to get around icebergs that were stranded on the seafloor. The ship would work into the wind-driven ice, nose around the iceberg, and head back for the shelter of the coast. At these times, Shackleton worried. He knew what would happen if a storm should spring up, and he always sighed with relief when the ship was once more safely inshore. Then one day, the Endurance had to go out into the ice. The sky darkened. A driving east-northwest wind sprang up. Ice, driven by the gale, closed around the ship, cutting off the route back toward shore. The temperature dropped. Suddenly, as the wind drove the pack against the ship, closing all navigable leads. The ice crumpled under the pressure of a more distant moving floes. Corrugations appeared in the ice surface. Hummocks rose across the pack. Worsley ordered full steam, and the ship struggled to break free. Shackleton watched, listened, and hoped, waiting for a shift in the wind or a slackening of the storm. But the gale continued. When it finally blew itself out on January 18th, 1915, the Endurance was caught fast, frozen, in the words of one crew member, like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. As hope of freeing the ship faded, Shackleton spoke to the men. He did not rage at all or show outwardly the slightest sign of disappointment. Alexander Macklin, one of the ship's 2 surgeons, wrote in his diary. He told us simply and calmly that we must winter in the pack, explained its dangers and possibilities, never lost his optimism, and prepared for winter. Shackleton ordered fires to be put out to save coal. Scientists and officers bunked in the deck housings, greeted his next order with enthusiasm. Harry Chippy McNish, the ship's carpenter, converted the nearly empty forehold into bottom deck quarters where the men could keep warm. Though small, their new quarters were so much warmer that they promptly named it the Ritz. The space was divided into a common area with bunk cubicles around the sides. Each cabin had 2 or 4 bunks in it. The temperature outside dropped. Storms sprang up. At one moment the sun shone, and the next the sky darkened and a 100-mile-an-hour blizzard would strike the ship. The days shortened. Temperatures set new low records, 30, 40, 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow drifted on the decks, and the men worked constantly to shovel it over the side. Ice coated the rigging and had to be chopped off with axes, and no sooner was it cleared than more formed. The pack creaked and groaned as the wind drove it from hundreds of miles away against the ship. Thwarted once again, Shackleton went among his men with patience and a smile. He lounged and talked and joked with them all. He had a special joke with the youngest member of the crew, Pierce Blackborough. The 19-year-old had stowed away on the ship when it left Buenos Aires. When he was discovered, he was brought to Shackleton, who said, "Remember, when we run out of food, you're the first one we eat." But Blackborough had pulled his weight with the men, and grinning, Shackleton reminded him he was emergency ration number 1. To starve off boredom and depression, Shackleton kept the men moving. They hunted seals and shot penguins. The men took the dogs to the ice, where they built ornate dogloos for them. Shackleton assigned drivers who began training their teams. Lanes between hummocks and ridges were given names well known to Englishmen. So a dog team might come racing along Northumberland Avenue into Trafalgar Square and then turn down the embankment. All on Antarctic ice, thousands of miles from home. The dog team drivers, new to their work, trained the half-wild animals until they formed dependable teams. Among the drivers, rivalry sprang up, and every night arguments filled the Ritz about which team was best. Soon all the members of the expedition became involved. Shackleton announced the Great Antarctic Derby. For days, preparations and more training absorbed the men. The day for the race didn't exactly dawn. It was dark, except at noon when a dim twilight filled the sky. The teams went into an opening between two ice hummocks, 700 yards from the ship, a landmark known as the Khyber Pass. Shackleton proclaimed himself starter. He appointed Worsley as judge. The men hacked out a grandstand in the ice near the finish line and seated themselves, amid the uproar of jokes, cheers, and last-minute bets. Money was of no real use here, so the men bet their chocolate and cigarette rations. 2 men at the finish line posted odds on the board slung from a crewman's neck. As an added holiday touch, the crewman wore a straw hat on top of his winter headgear. The gun cracked. The men cheered and the race was underway. The dogs strained at their harnesses and the sleds careened down the course. The men peered into the gloom, trying to see which team was ahead. The barks of the dogs and the shouts of the drivers grew louder as the 2 teams came into sight. Cheers went up from the men, and a flutter of canvas and handkerchiefs greeted Wild's team, which is the winner. Frank Hurley, the Australian photographer, was second. He quickly challenged Wild to another race, this time with loaded sleds. Several days later, Wild met the challenge. Each sled, heaped with 900 pounds of ballast, started from the Khyber Pass and raced toward the finish line. Wild won again. Then the judges disqualified him on the grounds that he had lost part of his ballast near the finish line. The lost ballast was Shackleton, who'd been tossed out of the sled roaring with laughter when a runner hit a snowdrift. As winter storms became more frequent, the men were forced to stay aboard the ship. They sang and had a singing contest to select the worst singer of the expedition. The vote went unanimously to Shackleton. During these monotonous weeks, the ship drifted with the ice pack to the north and west. The sun remained below the horizon. The expedition's only source of fresh meat disappeared as penguins and seals migrated north to open water. The men were warm and safe. With all the stores, food was plentiful. They had little to do but wait for release from the ice. To while away the time, they celebrated every possible occasion, birthdays especially. But the most important celebration took place on June 22nd, the shortest day of the year. Aboard the Endurance, in the Ritz, the men decorated the common room with bunting and flags. The cook prepared a feast of roast pork, gravy, stewed apples, peas, plum pudding, and hot cocoa. Songs and stories filled the evening. Alone in his cabin, Shackleton lay awake, making plans. If the ice freed the ship and all went well, he would return to South Georgia, refit, and come back to try again. Until late June, the pack had left the Endurance unharmed, but as July approached, movement and pressure in the ice began to affect it. The ship had drifted 300 miles. "The ship can't live in this," Shackleton told Worsley. "What the ice gets, the ice keeps." Shackleton watched as a great ice ridge grew on the horizon. Day by day, the ridge moved closer. The ice around the ship creaked, groaned, roared, chattered, and snapped. Worsley said, "It sounds like damned souls in torment." Shackleton kept his gaze fixed on the approaching ridge. Great chunks of floe, 5 and more feet deep and thick, as big as a city block, were pushed up over neighboring pieces as the pressure ridge bore down. The Endurance quivered as the first tremors reached the ship. Worsley glanced at Shackleton and caught a fleeting impression of defeat on his leader's face. Then Shackleton shook himself and hunched his shoulders. "It's a pity," he said, almost to himself, "but it can't be helped. We have to think about the men." Early the next morning, when the men completed their chores, a sound like 1,000 firing guns made everyone stop. In an instant, the Endurance was thrown on its side, until the portside lifeboats dangled only inches away from the ice. Worsley, eating breakfast with Shackleton and Wild, was thrown against the bulkhead. Shouts came from all over the ship. Fearing fire from lighted stoves, Worsley crawled through the ship. He put out fires and hurried on deck. The ice ridge was closer, but the sudden tossing of the ship was only a forewarning. There was more to come. Shackleton ordered the dogs on board. A large crack appeared in the ice. In a few moments, the dogloos crumpled and were buried under tons of ice. Moments later, the crack in the ice disappeared as the floes came together. Looking up, Worsley saw the ridge was closer to the ship, so high it blocked view to the northern horizon. Shackleton stood on the deckhouse giving orders. His commands came crisp and clear above the noise of the ice. There was no confusion. Shackleton was putting into operation his other plan, his plan for disaster. Chapter 3, Catastrophe. In the isolation of his cabin during the hours while others slept, Shackleton had planned what to do if the Endurance was lost. He knew the time of the ship's destruction was not far off. With the hull lying on its side in the ice, he ordered sleds packed with emergency supplies to be put overboard and hauled to a thick floe away from the ship. He and Worsley walked around the hull and inspected the damage. Surprisingly, they could see little. Inside the Endurance, the water began to fill the holds. A few hours later, the ice moved and the ship righted itself and settled once more back into the water. Men and sleds went back on board. All around the Endurance, ice moved constantly. Leads opened and closed. Hummocks rose from the level of the white surface. The noise of breaking floes was like a continuous roar of a passing train. The men had to shout to make themselves heard. Everyone knew now what lay ahead. None had the hope that the ship could survive. Most of the men held the knowledge to themselves. There was no use discussing the inevitable. Watches were set, 4 hours on and 4 off. To everyone, it seemed like Shackleton never slept. He was present whenever a fresh watch came on, and he was there when it went off. The forces of the Antarctic seemed to mock the small ship. The weather cleared. The sun shone. Light sparkled on the ice and flashed from the towering sides of distant icebergs. Yet the ice moved, and the pressure grew. Currents far to the north shifted, the floes pressing them against the long curving peninsula of Graham Land to the west. Floes jutted up suddenly and rose until breaking off. Ice rafted, sliding up over neighboring pieces and then shattering with a noise like a gunshot, sending 1,000 glittering splinters down onto the snow. The pressure lifted beams and timbers from the frame of the ship. Side planking opened and water cascaded in. McNish, the carpenter, built a dam across the lowest hold, but still the water rose. The men began using hand pumps. From the deck, Worsley watched water rush up from the pumps and over the sides, but the stream pouring from the hoses slowed to a trickle and then stopped. Hurrying below, Worsley learned the pumps were frozen and fouled. He ordered gallons of boiling water to thaw them out, and even tried a blowtorch, but without success. He knew the pipes, if clean, were large enough to permit water to flow through without freezing. But coal had been spilled in the lower hold. Bits of it mixed with coal dust and bilge grease caused the stoppage. He looked around in the dim light. Above his head, ice jammed against the ship, and any instant it might break through, letting in a cataract of black Antarctic water. Even while he stood estimating the problem, the water rose above his knees. There was only one solution: move all the coal and clean the pumps. Worsley sent the pump gang on deck. He went up and called for volunteers for the dangerous work. 2 officers, Lionel Greenstreet and Hubert Hudson, stepped forward and went below with Shackleton. The water was nearly waist high. With the air temperature only 7 degrees above zero, the men plunged their arms into the cold water and began their work. Over their heads, the ice shifted and planking snapped. Hour after hour, they picked up coal from around the pumps and threw it into the bunkers. Their hands and arms were numb. The water continued to rise, but the pumps were cleared. As the pump gang returned to work, Worsley, Greenstreet, and Hudson climbed out of the hold that might well have been their tomb and drank cups of steaming cocoa. They said nothing. The ice seemed to be waiting. The pressure did not lessen, but the air was calm, and after 2 days of windless weather, the Endurance was finally pumped dry. The respite was brief. Standing on the bridge 3 days later with Worsley, Shackleton pointed to a pressure ridge off the starboard beam. It was larger than the one that had thrown the ship onto the ice. Without speaking, Shackleton turned and pointed to another ridge off the port bow and yet another off the port quarter. All three were bearing down on the Endurance. The ridges struck the Endurance simultaneously. From stem to stern, the ship bent like a bow. Rigging whined under the stress. Timbers and beams buckled with a noise like a cannon. Water poured again into the ship. The rudder and sternpost were almost torn away. Sleds were lowered once more onto safe floes, and extra food quickly carried away from the ship. Everyone worked at top speed to get supplies off the doomed ship. In the midst of their work, and above the sound of the groaning ship and moving ice, came a strange noise. All hands stopped work. The noise continued. It was like the wailing of ghosts, the cry of mourners. "There!" someone shouted. "Look there!" On the ice, not 100 feet from the Endurance, stood a number of emperor penguins. They were watching the ship and crying out in tones no one had ever heard before. It was as if they sensed the ship was going down, that all was lost. The cool voice of Frank Wilde broke the spell. "You won't get home if you stand there gaping. Get the dogs off." One by one, the men turned away from the penguins and went back to work. Dogs were led to the rail, but they refused to leave the ship. Wilde rigged a canvas chute, and he began throwing the dogs onto it. They slid, howling and whimpering, to the ice and scrambled to their feet, shivering. Water filled the lower holds and flooded the Ritz. Ice speared the ship, some passing completely through one side and out the other. A mast toppled, and the ice-covered rigging clattered onto the broken deck as ice flows ground into the ship. At 5 p.m. she went down, Shackleton wrote in his diary. The stern was the last to go under the water. I cannot write about it. Even the polar veterans felt hope fading. After 281 days aboard the ice-bound Endurance, after all their work and hope and cheerful spirit, they were adrift on Antarctic ice. The nearest human settlement lay more than 1,000 miles away. There was no hope of rescue.